Decades of socialism have stifled Cuba's economy, but apparently the pandemic recession was the final straw. Cuba announced that it will expand the private sector economy to allow 2,000 types of private businesses instead of a previous 127. Now entrepreneurs will be allowed to hire more than just their family members, and they'll be allowed to rent out property that they own but don't live in. And this should help absorb some of the 500,000 government workers that are being laid off over the following months. Cuba has finally realized that the only way to create wealth for society is to free the people from the shackles of government. This isn't to say that Cuba is going full free market. For example, restaurants are still given absurd limits for the number of patrons that they can serve at one time. But that limit is being increased from 12 to 20, and now they can serve beef and lobster. Ooh. It's still ridiculous, but even some small reforms like these can create massive increases in the wealth of a nation that has been stifled by socialism for so long. Of course, when people aren't used to freedom, there can be a rough transition. For example, when the Republic of Georgia gained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, you might think that life could only get better compared to living under a communist dictatorship. But despite the communist regime's fall, deep state ex-members of the Soviet Communist Party still ruled the country, sort of like ex-KGB Putin over in Russia. And throughout the 1990s, as politicians battled for control of the newly independent nation, the economy came to a standstill. Its gross domestic product, GDP, actually decreased every year from 1990 through 1994. As hopes of a better future faded, anybody who had the means to flee the country did. From 1989 through 2002, census records show that the population of the country dropped 20%, partly due to a decreased birth rate, but mostly because of emigration. Georgia was just about at rock bottom when an anti-corruption, pro-market leader appeared. Mikhail Saakashvili came to power in 2004. As Georgia's president, he cut red tape, abolished import and export tariffs, fired half of the police force, invested in infrastructure, and revamped the entire government. Saakashvili's efforts paid off. Within a decade, Georgia's staggering transformation was beginning to become obvious. Today, Georgia is one of the safest and least corrupt nations on earth and regularly tops the ease of doing business ratings. Another example is that in 2009, Greece's budget deficit exceeded 15% of GDP, meaning that the government took on debt equal to 15% of the country's entire gross domestic product in 1 year. Greece's credit rating was downgraded and the cost to finance new debt soared, and Greece announced that it might actually default on its debt. The European Union came to its rescue with a bailout, but only in exchange for strict austerity measures. Greece had to cut 150,000 government jobs, decrease pension benefits for retired workers while increasing pension contributions from workers, and raise taxes. But this still wasn't enough. By 2012, Greece had a 25% unemployment rate, and its debt stood at 175% of GDP. For reference, the World Bank considers debt over 77% of GDP to be a sign of impending default, meaning you can't pay back the debts. Only by balancing its budget, taking on no new debt, privatizing government businesses, selling government assets, and further pension cuts was Greece finally able to claw its way out from disaster. And by 2020, it almost seems like Greece was smart enough to learn its lesson. Facing another crisis as tourism money dried up, Greece created a digital nomad visa to attract foreign capital, which offers a 50% reduction in income taxes for 7 years. Still, Greece was only able to avoid total disaster because of the European Union bailouts. And even now, Greece owes massive debts to the European Financial Stability Mechanism and Eurozone governments. So it's a bit shocking when you realize that in 2020, the United States government posted a $3.1 trillion deficit, which is over 15% of GDP. The US government debt is now 140% of GDP. Remember, a deficit of 15% of GDP was when Greece had their credit rating downgraded, and just 77% of debt to GDP is a sign of impending default. And even worse, the United States government doesn't have Papa European Union to bail them out. All it has is the Federal Reserve, which already expanded the money supply by 25% last year alone to buy government bonds and finance new debt. They printed this money out of thin air and dumped it into a shrinking economy. If bondholders get wise, as they did in Greece, then the only way to finance new debt will be for the Federal Reserve to print money. And that's a recipe for massive inflation. So what's the plan to avert disaster? Strict austerity measures? Cut government jobs? Balance the budget? Nope. Former Federal Reserve Chair and now Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, said recently that the smartest thing we can do is act big, starting with a $1.9 trillion COVID rescue package proposed by the Biden administration. The only reason that the United States has been able to make it this long without having to address its massive debt issues is because it can print dollars, just like Zimbabwe and Venezuela hyperinflating their currencies. The difference is that the US dollar is the world reserve currency. This means that there's almost an 8 billion person worldwide demand to absorb new dollars, which obviously Venezuela and Zimbabwe did not have. But this actually could be the year that the world loses confidence in the US dollar. According to Bloomberg, $8 trillion worth of government debt comes due this year. And added to the deficit of at least $2 trillion this year, we're talking about the United States having to find a buyer for $10 trillion of new US debt. China's already been paring down its US debt and probably won't be too interested in buying more. That leaves printing money as the only way to finance this new debt. State governments are already providing us a little microcosm to look at of the problems with these massive debts because they can't print their own money. High taxes, COVID lockdowns, rising crime, and civil unrest have all combined to make people flee states like California and New York. But these states haven't hit absolute rock bottom yet. So their solution is, drumroll please, to raise taxes and increase spending to make up for their fleeing residents and out-of-work victims of COVID lockdowns. When you actually have to start competing with relatively free and low-tax states like Texas and Florida, the real world comes at you fast. And yet the federal government is following New York and California's lead on a massive scale. Vice President Harris was a senator from California after all, and the administration says that it will model many of its progressive policies on the failed state. So that's why I say, just do it already. Get it over with. Let the commies take over and drive the US to rock bottom. The sooner that happens, the sooner we can start from a clean slate and rebuild. If the politicians were smart, they would default and begin austerity while the United States still had some credibility and leverage left. Because the longer that they go on with the money printing, the debt, and the descent into socialism, the fewer options the US will have. Instead, they'll print trillions of dollars for COVID recovery, Green New Deals, forgiving student debt, and whatever else they think up. Maybe even a new war on domestic terror. They'll slam the US into the red hot core of rock bottom, scorched earth humiliation. So the question is, how do you maintain or even grow your power in these pretty horrific scenarios? How do you make sure that you don't go down with the ship or even have the opportunity to supply some lifeboats for other people? One way is to be an early adopter of new technologies. For example, cryptocurrencies are seeing more and more mainstream spending options. For example, most recently, announcements from MasterCard and Visa that they will be integrated into their payment options. And some cryptocurrencies do seem poised for adoption in the event that the United States dollar inflates or even becomes worthless. I don't personally think it makes sense to get into cryptocurrencies for speculation alone just to turn them back into fiat dollars. The point for me has always been to gain some exposure to the future of money, to either hold it or use it. The possible future value increases or increased purchasing power of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Monero, that's an added benefit, but not the main point. Of course, gold and silver can give you a much safer bet to protect yourself against inflation, and even possibly a way to multiply your money in the event of hyperinflation. People have gotten rich in the past in those ways. And in the same way that you don't want to be in dollars when this all goes down, you don't want to be in certain places either. Certainly not New York or California, but maybe not even in the United States. More rural versus being in a city is definitely a safer bet as well, especially if you have a group of like-minded people around you. Then there is the online presence as well to think about. A lot of these alternatives to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are still up and coming, so you do have a chance to be an early adopter, get some of that prime real estate. That gives you a chance to grow with the platforms. As a reminder, I am now posting all my videos on BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey or Library. So make sure you go and follow me on at least one of those other platforms, or even better, join my email list and we'll always stay in contact even if YouTube decides to nuke me. Links in the description. I think these are the types of things to be thinking about. Where are you located? Physically, mentally, socially, and what roles can you fill in a crisis or disaster scenario that will help the people around you overcome? There's going to be a major transition, and helping people over the hurdles to smoothly transition into new money, new systems of governance, new types of education models, new social structures, that will put you in a leadership position of power. I'm Joe Jarvis. Thanks for watching. Come back and see me again soon.